For nearly a decade, John E. Barker had been a fixture at Houston's South Station. He arrived with the morning trains, long before the first crowd trickled in from the city's rising sun. Every day, he took the same spot near Exit 7, a long, drafty corridor lined with vending machines and faded posters no one read anymore. The bench there was slightly crooked, with a chipped armrest and one loose bolt beneath the seat. It didn't matter. It was where he belonged. He looked to be in his early 70s, though the lines on his face and the stiffness in his hands suggested he had carried more weight than most men his age. He wore a civilian jacket, a dark wool coat, 2 sizes too big, with the faint outlines of long-removed insignia. On its shoulder, a weathered patch barely clung to the fabric, the ghost of a unit crest long forgotten. His boots were military issue from another era, soles worn smooth, laces mismatched. He carried no bags, just a frayed notebook tucked into his coat and a pencil behind his ear, ground down until it could barely be held. Station staff noticed him, but never asked questions. Some figured he was homeless. Others thought he was just someone waiting, for a train, for a person, or maybe just for time itself to run out. He never caused problems. He never asked for help. Sometimes, early employees would leave a wrapped breakfast sandwich beside him. A janitor named Miguel often set down a styrofoam cup of coffee, black, no sugar, then disappeared without a word. Barker accepted the offerings with a nod, sometimes not even that. No one knew where he went at night. He was simply there in the morning, part of the station like the flickering overhead lights and the soft hiss of train brakes echoing through the platforms. He rarely spoke. Once in a while, he would mutter under his breath while scribbling in his notebook, hands trembling slightly. No one ever saw what he wrote. He guarded the pages with a quiet intensity, closing the cover the moment anyone glanced his way. The pages were creased and curling, held together with tape in places. Sometimes, he would stop mid-sentence and just stare at the concrete floor, lost in memory or thought or perhaps nothing at all. His presence became routine, a quiet constant in a station defined by movement. People rushed past with suitcases, children, coffee, and earbuds, weaving around him as if he were a forgotten signpost. At first, some passengers complained about the man on the bench. The station manager made a few attempts to relocate him, but after a while, they gave up. He wasn't hurting anyone. He didn't panhandle or sleep stretched across the seats. He just sat, every day, in the same spot, watching. Among the regulars, he earned quiet nicknames. The conductor on the 6:15 inbound called him Captain. A pastry vendor called him Sarge. Some just referred to him as that guy, a presence too subdued to earn a real name. And yet, for those who looked closely, there were clues. His posture was still straighter than most. He rose slowly, but with a sort of mechanical dignity, as though his body had been trained to endure things far worse than age. And once, when a group of high school kids spilled onto the platform laughing and jostling, one of them dropped a phone near his bench. Before anyone could react, he bent down and handed it back with practiced efficiency. The teen thanked him and ran off. Barker returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. He lived outside the radar of official systems. No one seemed to have his record. He had no listed address, no known emergency contact. His presence was both familiar and invisible. Over the years, rumors grew. Some thought he was a veteran who'd lost everything. Others believed he had once worked for the government, a marshal, perhaps, or a detective who saw too much. One worker said she'd once glimpsed a scar running along his collarbone, deep and discolored. Another swore he heard Barker humming an old military march under his breath, just once, during a thunderstorm that rattled the station windows. But no one ever asked. And Barker never offered. Outside the station, life moved on. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm of appointments, delays, and unread messages. No one remembered the man on the bench when they left, no one asked where he went when they returned. He simply faded into the background, a living ghost of order in a chaotic world. He feared hospitals more than winter. Some nights, when the air snapped with cold and the sky threatened rain, he would disappear for a few hours, but always returned by morning. He refused blankets offered by outreach workers. He accepted water from a stranger but pushed back when someone tried to hand him a pamphlet for shelter. It was as if he had made peace with the station, as if, in that liminal space between departures and arrivals, he had found the last corner of the world that asked nothing of him. And yet, beneath the silence, something about him remained alert. Like a veteran waiting for orders that never came. Like a man expecting a train no one else could see. By the time winter turned the station into a cold cave of steel and salt, he had become as much a part of the landscape as the clock above Gate 12. The staff stopped asking questions. The security guard stopped checking on him. Everyone just assumed he'd always be there. Until one day, when a new security officer joined the morning shift and didn't recognize the man near exit 7. The new security guard was young, fresh out of academy training, clean uniform, bright radio clipped to his chest like a badge of confidence. His name was Reed, and it was his third day on the job. Unlike the seasoned officers who knew how to blend into the rhythm of South Station, Reed carried an edge to him. He walked like someone trying to be noticed, checking corners no one paid attention to, tapping his pen against a clipboard with bureaucratic precision. He didn't know the man near exit 7. He saw a solitary figure with old patches and restless fingers scribbling in a notebook, sitting alone, unblinking in a place where people were supposed to move. And for reasons he couldn't explain, it unsettled him. Not because Barker had done anything, but because Reed had been trained to act when something felt out of place. That morning, the crowd was thinner than usual. A storm had knocked out several power lines across the suburbs, and train schedules were erratic. People were anxious, frustrated. Reed had already assisted with a minor altercation over platform signage. He was watching the benches now, scanning for anyone drawing unnecessary attention. That's when he heard it, a low, almost inaudible hum. The melody was slow, mournful. Reed recognized it vaguely, some kind of old military march. The man with the notebook wasn't looking at anyone, just humming, eyes distant. Reed radioed dispatch. He used the phrase individual exhibiting erratic behavior. The term was vague by design. It didn't require actual disruption, just suspicion. 2 officers arrived, one junior and one seasoned. The younger officer, like Reed, eyed Barker's jacket and the unshaven lines of his face, and already began drafting the image of a transient loiterer. The older one, Officer Wallace, approached more slowly, hands open, eyes cautious. When asked for identification, Barker didn't speak. He simply reached inside his coat and pulled out a thin leather wallet, the edges curled and faded. Inside was an ID card so worn the laminate had started to peel. A name was just barely legible. John E. Barker. The younger officer dismissed it, making a note about expired documentation. He motioned to take Barker's arm, not aggressively, just enough to suggest they were moving along. But Officer Wallace didn't move. He had seen that name before. Somewhere. And something about it scraped against a memory buried under 2 decades of service. He stepped forward, took the ID gently, and stared at it longer than anyone expected. His eyes flicked to the old patches on Barker's coat, then back to the card. The name clicked into place. It was not the name of a transient. It was the name of a U.S. Marshal. Wallace asked for a pause on the dispatch. He stepped back, dialing a number he rarely used, a contact at the Federal Marshal's Service. He didn't explain much, just recited the name, asked for confirmation. The voice on the other end went silent for a long time before asking him to repeat it. The match was immediate. John E. Barker. Former senior field agent. Attached to federal witness protection programs during the 1980s and 1990s. Decorated. Medal of Honor recipient. Presumed deceased since 1997 after multiple failed contact attempts following a medical discharge. Barker had not been loitering. He had vanished. The revelation spread like ink dropped into water. Calls were made. A supervisor arrived. Then someone from the local VA officers stepped aside, voices dropped to whispers. Reed stood uncertain, watching as the mood shifted without warning from authority to reverence. Barker sat unmoved. He still held the notebook, pencil resting in one hand. If he noticed a change in atmosphere, he gave no sign. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor tiles. A moment later, paramedics were called. Not because he was injured, but because protocol demanded a medical check for anyone in such conditions. They arrived quietly, checking vitals, scanning for signs of disorientation. He complied, calm and blank, his silence carrying more weight now than any words. No one put him in handcuffs. No one asked him to move along. Instead, a space was cleared. A chair was offered. A blanket. Someone brought water. Reed stood frozen, unsure of what to say, his clipboard suddenly useless. The man he had reported had once guarded federal witnesses, led raids, earned the highest military recognition for valor. And here he had sat, unnoticed, for years. The transport vehicle wasn't a cruiser. It was unmarked, federal. The agent who arrived had flown in that morning after the call reached Washington. He approached Barker with the slow respect of someone visiting a memorial. He didn't speak much, only offered his hand. Barker didn't shake it. But he looked up. Just once. It was the first time anyone at South Station had seen him lift his eyes. Then he stood, steady despite the years, and walked with quiet resolve toward the vehicle, disappearing from exit 7 as silently as he had appeared a decade before. No charges were filed. The junior officers returned to their rounds, subdued. Officer Wallace stayed behind, making notes he would later submit as evidence of a systemic failure, not of law, but of memory. A man like that should never have been forgotten. The station, for the first time in years, felt the absence of its silent watchman. The news spread in waves, rippling outward from Houston like a signal long lost but suddenly found again. What began as a footnote in a police report became the lead story on regional networks, then national media. The man quietly removed from South Station was not a transient, not a loiterer, not another forgotten soul on the margins. He was a decorated federal marshal, a war hero, and the recipient of the nation's highest honor. Johnny U. Barker had disappeared in the late 1990s following a debilitating stroke. After his discharge, he had returned home briefly, only to vanish weeks later. Attempts to contact him through veteran services, pension departments, and federal agencies all failed. No one had linked his name to the quiet man living under the radar, hiding in plain sight at the heart of the city. The hospital records told the rest. He had entered an emergency room in 1996 under a generic alias following a collapse in a bus terminal. The stroke had left him with partial memory loss and cognitive gaps. Without identification, he had been discharged to a public shelter system where he gradually fell through every safety net meant to catch him. For years, he wandered from one facility to another until he settled at the train station, drawn, perhaps unconsciously, to the rhythm and routine that mirrored the order his life once held. The story drew attention beyond sympathy. Veterans organizations demanded answers. Policymakers convened emergency panels. And within weeks, the Department of Veterans Affairs introduced a new identification initiative, an advanced system of biometric markers and visual registry checks for lost or disconnected federal personnel. It was called the Barker Protocol. Police departments across the country adopted changes. Officers received updated training. Before any citation or arrest of a homeless person for minor infractions, a mandatory background scan was instituted to detect service or federal affiliation. Outreach teams were expanded. Forgotten identities were reclaimed. At Houston's South Station, the bench near Exit 7 was left unoccupied for weeks. No one sat there. Staff placed a small bronze plaque on the wall behind it. It bore no date of birth or death, only the name, Johnny U. Barker. He watched over us in silence. The bench became a point of quiet pilgrimage. Veterans stopped by and left folded flags, coins, service ribbons. A girl once left a child's drawing of a train and a note that simply read, "Thank you for protecting us, sir." In a small courtroom 2 months later, Barker's story intersected again with the life of someone he had once saved. Decades earlier, in Arizona, during a hostage crisis in a federal building, he had negotiated the release of a young intern caught behind the glass doors of a conference room. That intern, now Judge Elena Ruiz, presided over the review of his identity confirmation. She recognized him the moment he was brought into her courtroom, older, frielier, but unmistakably the same man. The room fell silent when the details were read aloud. Service record. Medal of Honor. Field operations. Protective custody work. The files painted a picture few had known but all now respected. No more questions were asked. No more formalities followed. He was cleared of all charges, not as a courtesy, but as a correction of history. A full reinstatement of identity followed. His birth certificate was reissued. Military ID reprinted. Service rank acknowledged. Pension restored retroactively. He was moved to a dedicated veteran housing facility in the outskirts of Houston, where the rooms were modest, but clean. A therapist was assigned to help him document his memories. The battered notebook he had carried for years was digitized and archived by the National Library of Veterans Affairs. Though he could not remember all of what he'd lived through, certain fragments returned. A name. A mission. A scent of fuel in the desert. A face from a witness protection program, a woman and her child, safe in a new life because of a document he once delivered under cover of night. These fragments became the building blocks of something quieter than memory, peace. On the first anniversary of his rediscovery, a ceremony was held at the federal courthouse. No speeches were prepared. Instead, a silence was observed. Veterans stood at attention. Officers, lawyers, and journalists gathered not in spectacle, but in stillness. Then, one by one, people approached and placed objects at the foot of the stage: medals, caps, ribbons, notebooks. A small boy, perhaps 10 years old, saluted and walked away. Barker stood briefly, supported on one side by a VA nurse. He wore a simple Navy suit provided by the Veterans Foundation. A new medal hung around his neck, issued not for combat, but for endurance. It bore no name on the front, only the words, "To be remembered is to be seen." He remained at the facility for several years. He spent his mornings writing, even if the pencil shook in his grip. Some days, he stared out the window for hours, watching the traffic move along the highway, always from left to right, like trains. He never asked for pity. Never asked for anything. But he had been seen. And that, finally, was enough.